Hello, everyone. My name is Ravi Dutta. I am a Hazard Mitigation Assistance Specialist for FEMA Region 10 on the non-disaster grants team. I want to acknowledge that we also have Kayla Keelan from our team helping to answer questions, and also Brennan Menegini, our team lead, helping to answer questions. And I'm going to hand it over to my co-presenter, Mark, now.
All right. Let me know if you hear me. I think I'm coming through. So just welcome. I'm sorry?
I was just saying, yep, loud and clear.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Ravi. So my name is Mark Stewart. I work the disaster grant side of the House in FEMA Region 10 in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Branch. But I'm here to talk to you today, help with Ravi, and talk to you about developing a good project application for BRIC. So next slide, please. So again, this is one of several webinars that we're conducting this fall. We've already completed 3. We're number 4 here, project development application today. Next week, just as a quick preview, we're going to be talking about benefit cost analysis basics, and I'll be helping present that also. We'll refer to BCA's benefit cost analysis, cost effectiveness a couple times today, but next week is when the meat and potatoes will be shared. Then we have 2 more after that, which will help introduce you to FEMA Go, our application platform for BRIC. And then the next and the last session that we have coming up at the end of the month is on FEMA grants management. So next slide, please. So just a few housekeeping details, and sorry I had a little trouble getting logged on today. Michelle may have covered some of this, but please keep your microphones on mute. But we do welcome questions, and feel free to ask those in the chat box, or a little later we'll solicit some questions. We have some interactive knowledge checks, which you saw the first one. It wasn't a knowledge check, but the little survey that Michelle asked you to complete at the front. So these are going to be totally anonymous, so no one will know your answers. So if you have any sort of technical issues with the session today, please send a direct chat message to Michelle, and she can help you out. And again, today on this session is myself and Ravi. And next session, please. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. Okay, so our agenda here is we're going to get started here. Ravi's going to share about the BRIC program, give you a little overview. I think we do this on every webinar, but we just want to make sure that for the folks who are new today, that you get a brief understanding of the program. And then Ravi and I are going to be sharing, kind of doing a tag team approach in talking about project eligibility, what makes for an eligible project, talk about developing your project, what do you need to develop a quality application for your project. We're going to talk a little bit about nature-based solutions and how to address that in your application. Then what are considerations for making sure you have a complete application? That's really important, especially when you go into, if you're planning on going into the competitive part of BRIC, it's very important to have a complete application. And then Ravi will share a little bit about resources that are available to help you out with your work in the coming months. So now over to Ravi for our overview with BRIC.
Thank you, Mark. So yes, I will give you an overview of BRIC. Thank you. BRIC is a nationally competitive grant program. Its priorities are to incentivize public infrastructure projects, as well as incentivize projects that mitigate risk to one or more lifelines, also to incentivize projects that incorporate nature-based solutions, and projects that incentivize modern building codes. And for 2021, there is a new priority to enhance climate resilience. Federally recognized tribes, states, and territories are eligible for BRIC as long as they have had a major disaster declaration in the past 7 years. However, every tribe, state, and territory did receive a major disaster declaration in spring 2020, so thereby all are eligible until at least 2027 for now. Next slide, please. BRIC's total budget for fiscal year 2021 is $1 billion. Of that, $25 million is set aside for tribal nations, and $919 million is in the national competition for mitigation projects. Next slide, please. Under the tribal set-aside, the federal share per grant must be $1 million or less, and under the national competition, the federal share can be up to $50 million. Up to 10% of a project sub-application budget can be for information dissemination activities like flyers and handouts, and you can submit more than one sub-grant or sub-application. Next slide, please. The standard cost share for subgrants is 75% federal share and 25% local share. For communities classified as economically disadvantaged rural communities, there is a 90% federal share and 10% local share. To be classified as economically disadvantaged rural community, or EDRC, you should be a community of 3,000 people or less and not be within a corporate boundary of a larger city or area. Additionally, residents should have an average per capita income equal to or less than 80% of the national per capita income, based on best available data. For the most current information on the national income, you can go to the website www.bea.gov, shown in the bottom right. Next slide, please. So we were just talking about cost shares, and sometimes we'll use the term cost share, sometimes we'll use the term match. We use both interchangeably. A match commitment letter is required from the tribal board or executive, and this letter should identify where funds for the local cost share would come from. In addition to funds from the tribe, potential match sources could be quantified staff time for project management and financial management, quantified staff time and volunteer time for community outreach to develop the project. Could also include in-kind donations, such as personnel time, services, or materials. For all of this, careful documentation is required, and it's important to track the number of hours and the hourly rate of donated time by individuals. You can find more details about this in the Hazard Mitigation Cost Share Guide, and we'll try and get a link to that in the chat. Get there, I think it's coming. Next slide, please. BRIC can also fund management costs. The management costs can include administrative costs and indirect costs. There are two ways that you can request management costs. So one is for subgrant management costs. You can take a project sub-application budget and add 5% of that to the total costs and include all of that in the project sub-application budget. Another way is that you can take 10% or less of the cost of your total application. So that would be all of your sub-applications, and make another sub-application for which the budget is that amount. And you can do both. So you can have both the 5% added to any or all sub-applications and also the separate sub-application for 10% or less of the total cost of the grant. If you are requesting indirect costs, there must be an indirect cost rate agreement, and you must include that in your sub-application. Next slide, please. So now we're on to project eligibility. And let me see here. So I think we're on slide 13 right now. Let's see here. Yeah, okay, great. So to be eligible for a project sub-application, you do need to have a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan. If you don't already have one, you can submit a sub-application for help in developing a plan. We had a webinar about that on September 23rd, which you can find in the website for our Region 10 BRIC Tribal webinars. Next slide, please. So these are some eligible project activities. Some examples are structure elevation, safe room construction, wildfire mitigation, and generators and property acquisition. And then next slide, please. And these are examples of projects that are not eligible. So projects that do not reduce the risk to people, structures, or infrastructure are not eligible. Projects where physical work has occurred prior to award are not eligible. Also, what would not be eligible is projects dependent on another phase of a project in order to be effective. Studies that are not directly related to design and implementation of a proposed project are not eligible. Preparedness measures or response equipment is not eligible for mitigation funding. Projects consisting or constructing new buildings that don't already exist would not be eligible. Exceptions to that would be a culvert to bridge upgrade or code plus projects where mitigation could fund extra costs to meet higher building code standards. Projects that involve land that is contaminated with hazardous waste are not eligible unless the site is cleaned up at non-grant expense and certified as clean. Next slide, please. So yeah, now we have a question for everyone. So is the replacement of an obsolete bridge or utility system an eligible project? Yes or no? So, yeah, Michelle, could you let me know when we can proceed?
Yep, I've got one more person working on it, and if Dave just hit submit, I will put those answers out. Looks like we're pretty split across the board, actually.
Okay, no problem.
Yep, you've got about half of the folks that said yes and half of the folks that said no.
All right, do we have has everyone responded? Oh, okay, take a look. Okay, so we have about, all right. So 4 said yes, 5 said no, 8 said no answer. So the answer is no. If you can refer to the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance, page 43 will list some ineligible activities. And one of them is replacement of obsolete structures with no increase in level of protection. And sort of by obsolete, that means that it's just not being used. So that would not be eligible. And now I will hand it over to Mark to carry it forward.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. So some of you may already have a notion of the kinds of projects that you want to submit for grant funding under the BRIC program, and some of you may not. You know, you have some hazards that have impacted your community, impacted your people, and you want to try to do some things to better protect your community assets, the homes, the infrastructure in your community, and so forth. So if you're not sure what kind of project to apply for, first check with your hazard mitigation plan. So those of you with hazard mitigation plans will have gone through a process to help identify the hazards in your community, the types of buildings and infrastructure, try to identify those structures that are potentially vulnerable, and then at least develop some recommendations for projects to help increase the level of resilience in your community. So your projects have to be consistent with your hazard mitigation plan. So you don't necessarily have to have your project specifically identified. For example, we want to elevate these 5 structures in this specific cul-de-sac because of flooding, for example. But you have to at least, your hazard mitigation plan has to at least address the flooding hazard before you can apply for flood-related projects. So for example, if your mitigation plan focuses on earthquakes because that's what you're most concerned with, but an opportunity has arisen for that identified you have some vulnerability to flooding and you want to address that in the grant program, you would not be eligible to do that because your mitigation plan doesn't address floods. So project ideas in your plan can be broad to account for consistency in the application. So again, as long as you're addressing a hazard in your mitigation plan, you can request funding for a project to mitigate damage from that hazard. Next slide, please. Okay, if you're starting from the ground floor, a white piece of paper, you have this idea that you want to pursue. So here's some things to think about and consider. So, you know, what kind of projects could be implemented in your community, and what are the consequences of each? So what that means is, you know, kind of developing your pro and con list of, okay, if I did project X, you know, what are the benefits to my community? And on the other side of the page, you know, what are the costs to my community? You know, you might find out that you have what you're proposing or what you're thinking about is tremendously expensive and your community can't afford it. Okay, so are there alternatives that you could look at and that kind of thing. So some specific things to consider is whether the project's eligible for funding. It's in the identified category of eligible projects. Will the project reduce the vulnerability of the identified area of your community, the specific structures or infrastructure that you've identified? Is it consistent with your mitigation plan? Is it technically feasible? In other words, you know, can it be installed and will it be effective? I mean, you might have these grand ideas, but you may not be able to implement them for a variety of reasons. What's the cost? Again, different types of projects, you know, cost different amounts, and depending upon location, that's certainly in play too. So that's something to think about. Is it cost effective? And we'll get into that a little bit today, but take a more a deeper dive on cost effectiveness next week in our webinar, so please come back for that. But essentially, the bottom line for a project being cost effective is you would need to demonstrate you're going to save at least $1 in a reduction of damages for every dollar that you spend on the project. Okay, there are potentially some environmental or historic preservation considerations. For example, is your project site right in the middle of some sensitive habitat for identified endangered species, or is it historic, or is it near a cultural site that's very sacred to your community? So these are things to think about and factor into your consideration of the project. And does your project have the support of your community? It's one thing if a project does, and another if it does not. I mean, if you're the proponent and nobody else, agrees that for whatever reason, maybe that's not the project to pursue right at the moment. Okay, next slide, please. Look at any sort of special considerations that you might need to think about. Community priorities. Maybe that's not where we want to focus our attention and our resources and our finance right at the moment. Do you have the resources to be able to pull off the project? For example, if the project needs a level of engineering, do you have an engineer in your community that can work with you, or do you have to hire this sort of subject matter expertise to help you? Again, are there special cultural considerations that need to be looked into? Again, most likely that would be the building type or location to where those resources are. Are there any sort of community conditions that needed to be taken into account? Are there things like height restrictions in your community? Are there agreements with nearby villages or communities that need to be factored in to the equation? And for example, if you're doing anything that revolves around residential properties, is there a homeowner association, and what are the bylaws and what are the implications of what those bylaws say to what you're thinking about in terms of your project? Next slide, please. So you can think about this as a process, and we'll get into a little more detail here in a little bit. So essentially, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that the reason you're attending this webinar and the series that we're putting on here this fall is because you've identified a need for some sort of action in your community, right? And you're eager to learn about, how do I look at my problem? What are the considerations I need to make? Are there alternatives that I need to explore? And if you've identified alternatives, then let's dig a little deeper and scope those out and analyze them and figure out whether you can afford it, whether it's cost effective, whether your ideas are going to be, are they technically feasible, and so forth. And then through this process, identifying the activity that best meets not only the community needs, but also the requirements of the BRIC grant program. And as you've walked through this process, and I'm assuming now you're pretty much at the place where you've identified your project and now you want to start doing the project assembly and develop your project for submission for grant funding. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to start talking about the elements that you'll need to put together a good project application. So one thing to remind yourself is that this, for large projects, if it's greater than the tribal set-aside or your community set-aside, if it goes into the national competition, you need to be very aware that you'll need to put your best foot forward in terms of telling your story about your community, about the project, and putting together a solid application. So the kind of the basic elements of all of this is initially, the grant application form. So for some grant programs, there's pieces of paper that you fill out, essentially. But here for BRIC, we have an application, electronic application called FEMA Go. And in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a session on FEMA Go. So please come back to that, learn a little bit more about that process and that system. So you'll need to become familiar with the application forms through that electronic process. You'll need to identify what we call an authorized agent. Now, this is the individual from your tribe, from your community, that represents you, is your main point of contact with FEMA, so that if we have questions about the project, this is the individual that we go to as kind of the go-between for your project. If the project is funded, this is the individual who would accept the grant award and so forth. So again, determine who in your community best fits this assignment, if you will, and let us know who that is. You'll have an opportunity to identify this individual in your application. Scope of work, this is where you describe what it is you want to do, where it's going to go, who it's going to impact, and so forth. We're going to talk about this in a little more detail in just a minute. Project schedule. How long is the project going to take to implement from start to finish? We have some timelines that you need to be aware of, and we'll cover that in just a moment. You'll need to develop a cost estimate, a budget for the project to tell us how much it's going to cost, what are you spending the money on, and so forth. Are there any sort of environmental or historic preservation issues that should be looked at or examined? And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then, is your project cost effective? And you'll demonstrate that through providing us with a copy of your benefit cost analysis. We'll touch on that briefly today, but again, much more detail next week at this time. Next, please. Okay, taking a little deeper dive into some of these elements. Your scope of work. This is really where you provide a detailed explanation of what you want to do, the expected milestones, and the deliverables that you have in terms of your project. So just think of it in terms of answering a number of questions. And the more details that you can provide to help the reviewers understand your community, your setting, the community setting, the hazard that you face, and so forth, it helps us really understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. So in the scope of work, you would want to identify things like what's the problem to be mitigated, what's the proposed project, how will it solve the problem, who's affected, who benefits essentially if, who's affected by not having your mitigation measure in place now, and who's going to benefit from that a little bit later. Where is it located in your community? Who's doing the work? This is where you describe, you're hiring contractors to do this sort of work, and we're going to have our community do some of the work here, and so forth. That's where you talk about how it's going to be implicated, and then timelines and milestones for your project. Next, please. So you can support your scope of work through documentation. Some examples of documentation that you might want to provide would, first of all, be photographs, not only of structures that are impacted, that have been impacted in the past, and if you've got damage pictures or watermarks for floods, or pictures of erosion that's taking place in your community. Those are great. Any sort of studies that have taken place in your community, about the hazards that you're facing and you want to mitigate. Maps are very helpful in identifying locations of structures that you want to do some mitigation activity on in terms of where they're at in relation to hazard areas, for example, where they're located in your community and so forth. Now, for example, studies, what I would suggest is, instead of plopping a 1,000-page study of your community's flood problem in the application, is to just pull out those few pages that are most essential, that really tell the story that you're trying, to help support the story that you're trying to tell. Just provide those pages along with, say, a cover sheet, a cover page of the study, and so forth. So that always helps. Really what it does is it provides context to your community. It provides context to your problem that you're wanting to solve and the project that you're proposing. Next, please. Another important element is your work schedule and task. Now, it doesn't have to be a fancy Gantt chart like you see on the page, but clearly that does help. And I think we're going to see some examples here, excuse me, in a bit, that shows how you can do this in the FEMA Go application. Excuse me. So what you want your work schedule to do is identify the milestones and tasks that you've identified in your scope of work. It should be realistic. You need to work on, develop a schedule for your work that completes it within 36 months, because that's the period of performance that will be established. Once the award is made, you have 36 months to complete that project. Now, you can ask for more time in the application. You will need to provide a justification for that. So for projects that are in the national competition, your schedule will need to include at least one or more go, no-go milestones. Now, these essentially are major milestones, major points in the project, whereas if you get there and you can't complete it, then you're basically, that pretty much does your project in, if you will. So you'll need to identify key points or key decision points on whether to continue with the project or not. Next slide, please. And here's a sample FEMA Go project schedule. And this works very well. Basically, on the left-hand column, you're identifying the various discrete tasks that you will be accomplishing in your scope of work. For example, this one has initiating the project, for example, signing and reviewing the grant award, reviewing plans with the community and so forth. And then it talks about hiring contractors, purchasing or leasing equipment and supplies that'll be necessary, doing some construction, relocating structures onto the housing pads, getting the project inspected, and then what we call closeout, or basically all the things you need to do to wrap up the project and prepare the paperwork for us to use to close out the grant award and the project. Next, please. The cost estimate or your budget. Your costs should reflect your scope of work and align with your milestones and tasks. Now, we have a form that can help you do that, and it's SF424C, Budget Information for Construction Programs form. You can find this on grants.gov. If you look under the SF424 family of forms, this will help your project align with the Office of Management and Budget cost categories for construction programs. Provide supporting documentation to help us understand what the various costs are involved in your project. So, for example, if you're renting equipment or buying supplies, please describe what those are. Why you're renting supplies or renting equipment versus using what you have on hand, why you're needing to do that, and so forth. We'd also like you to include a brief narrative that describes the elements of your budget and to provide whatever documentation that you have available to help us understand the estimated costs. So we also ask you to include management costs in your budget. That's especially true if you're including management costs in the project sub-application budget and not doing a separate management cost application. And in your sub-application, your management costs can be up to 5% of the cost of the project. Next slide, please. So, and the kinds of things that you want to put in your budget or consider for your budget are these sorts of costs. A manager to someone you hire to manage your project, or you have in your community to manage the project from start to finish. Contractors, if you have to hire contractors to do the work. Engineering or architectural designs. Another cost that you might incur, especially if you're in an area with a lot of cultural resources, you may need to consult an archaeologist, and those sorts of costs would be eligible for your project budget. Of course, anything related to construction, the labor, the equipment, the supplies, and so forth. Any sort of permits or surveys that you need to have done. Any sort of site preparation or restoration that you'll need to do, as well as mobilization and demobilization of contractors. And then if you're asking for reimbursement of your costs to prepare your application in what we call the pre-award period, we would want to see those reflected in the budget also. Next slide, please. Pre-award costs. Okay, these are costs directly related to develop your grant application or sub-application that are incurred prior to the date that you receive a monetary award for your project from FEMA. So the pre-award period starts on the date that the application period opens. So that period is now open, so the costs that you incur to develop your application now can be claimed as pre-award costs if you wish. Now, examples of that would be development of your benefit cost analysis. If you hire a contractor especially to help you with that, those costs are eligible as pre-award. Collection of your environmental or historic data that you will need, preparing for the design of your project, any sort of costs you might have in terms of community outreach or meetings that you do on your project. And you have to request them in your application as a line item, cost line item. Now, what you cannot do is break any ground. If your project has any sort of construction involved, do not put a shovel in the dirt until you get your grant award, because any costs that you incurred doing that in the pre-award period are not eligible. So, and one other thing to note is that pre-award costs are not guaranteed. They are only funded if your project and sub-application is selected and funded. Next slide, please. Okay, this looks like a screenshot of cost estimate from FEMA Go. So here's basically a 4-line budget that has identified costs for design and engineering, construction, equipment, and contingency costs. So again, we talked a minute ago about budget narrative. So your budget narrative you'd want to briefly describe what it is that you're spending your design and engineering money on, and so forth. So you're basically telling us what you're spending your money on in terms of these cost categories. So the cost of this budget, this project is $293,475 and change. And I believe that FEMA Go rolls that up. And then you can ask for management costs at 5%. And you'll see that number there as identified as $14,673 and change. And so the total project budget for this project is $301,149.50. Next, please. So here's basically a sample FEMA Go budget item that you can use in FEMA Go to identify, okay, so you have equipment. You have 2 of your equipment. So I'm assuming you've got 2 items that are being either rented or purchased. And the unit price for these is $300, but the total for equipment here is $6,000. This must be 20 for a quantity, and $300 for the unit price to get $600. And then you select the budget class, equipment, and you can check the box to indicate that this is one of the items I would like to include in my pre-award costs. Next, please. Okay, I mentioned a budget narrative earlier, and so that really supports your budget and your cost estimate by describing how the budget relates to implementing the scope of work, giving us background on how your budget was put together and what each line consists of and means. Essentially, what your budget narrative does is it helps us understand more about your project, more about the project costs. It's really important context to help the reviewer understand, get a better understanding of your project and its costs. Next, please. Okay, here's an example here. This particular budget has 4 line items. There's one on personnel and staff, one for engineering fees, equipment purchase, and then construction. So for example, what we're looking for in terms of personnel and staff is identifying those people involved in the project from, pretty much probably from the project management standpoint. So this identifies the individuals that'll be involved, which is the utilities director, and there's 3 city staff members. It identifies the number of hours they'll each be involved in the project and their hourly rate. So it basically helps us understand this breaks down the costs and gives us great context, so we know that you've got your personnel and staff costs well documented and explained. So again, for engineering fees, these are the costs for the city's contracted engineering firm to oversee design and construction documents, covers the cost for the engineering firm to bid the project and perform contract and grant administration activities. So again, I won't go through the other 2, but you get the point. Again, this provides very important context for the reviewer and really helps explain the cost of the project. Next, please. And I'll send it over to Ravi, who will continue from here and talk to you about nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Mark, very much. A priority of BRIC is to incentivize projects that incorporate nature-based solutions, and they are also part of technical criteria. So what are nature-based solutions? According to this guide that's pictured here, they are sustainable planning, design, environmental management, and engineering practices that weave natural features into the built environment to build resilient communities. There will be a link to this guide in the resources section at the end of the presentation. Nature-based solutions can also be known as green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, or engineering with nature. And whereas nature-based solutions could be known as green infrastructure, traditional non-nature-based solutions would then be known as gray infrastructure. Next slide, please. Nature-based solutions can be broken down into 3 categories. So one category is watershed or landscape scale, and examples of that can include floodplain restoration, where you have floodplains of plants, trees, and vegetation that reduce erosion, filter pollution, and provide a habitat for sea life. Another could be restored wetlands, which absorb and slow runoff and sustain healthy ecosystems. Another category is neighborhood or site scale, and examples of that could include green roofs, where vegetation on a roof absorbs rainfall rather than letting it drip to the ground and cause flooding and runoff. And another could be vegetated swales or channels of trees that treat and absorb stormwater as it flows down a slope. Another category is coastal areas, and examples of that include living shorelines, which combine natural elements like plants with structural elements like rock and sand to slow waves and reduce erosion. And another example could be waterfront parks that can be designed to absorb tidal and storm floodwater. Now, these are some examples of nature-based solutions, but I want to give a reminder that our context here is integrating these into hazard mitigation projects. So basic hazard mitigation assistance requirements, like the benefits cost analysis, would still need to be met. BRIC could not likely fund simply building a waterfront park by itself, as one example, but if it's using acquired property where structures were too close to a flood zone and will be demolished to then build a waterfront park, that might be more eligible. Next slide, please. Some may ask, in addition to what we've heard so far, why else would we want nature-based solutions? Besides being mitigation solutions, these can make a community more attractive to new residents and businesses. And nature-based solutions could be more long-term solutions with less requirements for maintenance. Next slide, please. Some other things to be aware of for both better and for worse are that in a benefits cost analysis, you can count the environmental and social benefits from nature-based solutions as secondary benefits. And I'll add a plug there that our benefits cost analysis webinar will be next week, and Mark will be presenting that. Moving on, however, note that not all project types are eligible for these environmental benefits in the benefits cost analysis, or BCA. Some nature-based solutions may have larger initial costs, even though they'd have greater long-term benefits. And be aware that if more project scoping is in order before actually pursuing a project with nature-based solutions, you can submit a project scoping sub-application for nature-based solutions. And a side note there, we had the project scoping webinar on September 30th, and you can find that in the website for our webinars. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a logjam as a positive alternative to riprap. Riprap has been the common gray infrastructure solution for river flood control, shown in the bottom picture. However, riprap can also accelerate speed of river flow and increase downstream erosion threats. Over time, rocks can fall into water and harm sea life. The above picture shows the logjam, which is a nature-based alternative that slows down water flow and supports sea life with much less risk of dangers from deterioration. Next slide, please. In this example, Lion Creek in the city of Lake Forest Park, Washington, would experience frequent flooding when heavy rain would cause Lion Creek to overflow into the surrounding area. A proposed solution to this was an underground high-flow bypass storm sewer, but environmental reviews found that this could have a negative impact on the fish population. So ultimately, they chose a nature-based solution that involved restoring a creek area to add natural flood storage capacity. This solution protected over 20 homes, a fire station, and a town center from recurring floods, and removed barriers to fish passage, and reestablished floodplains in 2 parks. This had approximately the same cost effectiveness and life expectancy as gray infrastructure alternatives, plus the additional environmental benefits. Next slide, please. So now we have a knowledge check, which says, which of the following is not a nature-based solution category? And you have your choices there. I think we're still getting results, right? Well, what do we have here? The very good results there. The majority were correct. So yeah, you may remember that gray infrastructure is the traditional non-nature-based sort of solutions for infrastructure. So now I hand it back to Mark.
All right, I'm unmuted now. So now we're going to talk about some things to think about in terms of developing a complete application. Next, please. So the review process that your sub-applications are going to go through is kind of a two-step process. And any projects that are funded with hazard mitigation assistance grant funds, whether it's BRIC or flood mitigation assistance or hazard mitigation grant program, have to demonstrate that they're feasible and effective at mitigating the risks that are identified. So our review process for BRIC looks like this. So initially, the application is looked at for in terms of an eligibility review. So the whole package is looked at for completeness, content, and so forth. The scope of work is looked at to make sure that it's understandable and complete, well documented, and so forth. And then after the eligibility review, it goes through a technical review where it's looked at in terms of feasibility and effectiveness. Is it cost effective? And what I will tell you here is that whatever benefit cost analysis you submit, it will be looked at again fresh based on information that you provide with your BCA. Sometimes that's beneficial to projects and sometimes it's not, and it really depends on, you know, the documentation that's provided. And they will look at it in terms of compliance with the variety of environmental or historic preservation laws and executive orders that are in place at this time. Next, please. Okay, the feasibility and effectiveness review is going to look at, you know, how effective is the project in mitigating the risks that are posed by the hazard, looking at whether the cost estimate is reasonable, does it conform with engineering practices, codes, standards, and so forth, and does it conform with its work schedule. So provide information on your decision-making process to help the reviewers understand what sort of alternatives did you look at, because we're looking to see if this is the only thing you're considering, and probably have some serious questions about the project if you don't address, well, in addition to our favored project that we're proposing here, we also looked at option A and option B. And this is what they were designed to do, but this is why they weren't feasible for us at this time. Okay. We'll look at the technical documentation that you provide with your application that helped you guide your decision making. And we're going to be looking at your description of why the project you're proposing for funding is the best option. Next, please. So some of the information that we'll be looking for are things like damage history and information on the structures and facilities that are involved in the project. So for example, we might be looking at information on a road, let's say, and you'll say, well, it's going to cost us to replace it is $400,000. But maybe just to repair it to restore the loss of function, that occurred is maybe $250,000. All right, we look at the various hazard events, and you'll need to identify specific hazard events for the most part if you're using the benefit cost analysis tool. And we're going to be looking at things like we need recurrence intervals on various storm events. For example, a 25-year flood or a winter storm that you're considering in this project has being a major factor while you're making the applications and so forth. So in the kinds of information we're going to be looking for in terms of individual structures are, who are the owners, where's the location. You can provide a street address for those of you that don't have a street address. You'll need to provide a latitude and longitude coordinates. Actually, you'll need to provide those with any structure anyway before closeout, so best to grab it up front. What's the building type? Is it a home? Is it a factory? Is it, a school? Is it city hall? Is it a wastewater treatment system and so forth? What are replacement values for the project? What are the displacement costs? These are the costs that come into play when you have to temporarily relocate your services, provide them at another location while repairs are affected to the impacted structure. And then things like, what's the demolition threshold? So for example, damage demolition threshold for the most part is considered 50% damage to the structure, means it's not repairable, but some communities have established codes that have a different threshold, so you need to be aware of what those are in terms of your community or your county. So if you have another facility like a school district office or, like I said, water treatment plant and so forth, you're going to have to describe the utility or the facility type, the number of customers that are served, provide damage estimates, loss of function estimates, and to get at the value of the service that facility provides to the community on a daily basis. And essentially the benefit cost analysis can help calculate some of these factors like loss of function impacts, value of service, and so forth. So more next week on that. Next, please. So again, for feasibility and effectiveness, we're looking for documentation in the form of engineering designs, schematics, and so forth to help support what it is you're doing. If you're doing a retrofit on a facility or a utility, for example. We're going to be looking for the building codes, engineering standards that are used. We want to make sure that the engineering design is from a registered professional engineer, and how we determine that is any sort of engineering documentation should have the engineer's stamp on it, which indicates they are a registered professional engineer. We're going to want to know a little bit about the level of protection provided by the proposed project. So for example, if you're elevating the home above what's called the base flood elevation, then you're basically providing protection against the 100-year flood. If it goes higher, then obviously it could provide protection for floods that are much larger, say a 200-year flood or 500-year flood and that sort of thing. So for earthquakes, we use things like the design level earthquakes, and there's a recurrence interval that's attached to that. Residual risk to the structure after you build the project. I think there's only one project type that we are familiar with that absolutely there's no residual risk, and that's when you remove a structure from a hazard area and do not replace it. Basically, you're turning the land area into open space, so there's no more people to impact, there's no more structure to impact, and so for that project, there's no residual risk. For others, there is some level of risk. And so you'll need to discuss that. I mean, as you're thinking about this, there is some point, your mitigation is going to work to a certain point. You've designed it to a certain design level earthquake or to a flood level or what have you. So, we'll need to see documentation related to that. And then you'll need to certify that your design follows any and all applicable building codes and engineering standards. And we do have some on the FEMA website that you can use for a number of types of projects. And here's some examples: safe room, wind retrofit, and flood mitigation projects. Next, please. Cost effectiveness, we've mentioned that again. So the bottom line is your analysis needs to show that your project is going to save at least $1 for every dollar that it costs. And the benefit cost analysis is the way that that is demonstrated. So we have an Excel workbook that you use. It's called our tool version 6.0. We'll talk about that a little more next week. So, and the framework that we use to determine cost effectiveness has been set up by the Office of Management and Budget. Okay, so essentially, again, the BCA determines whether the cost of investing in the mitigation project will result in sufficient reduction in damage in the future to justify spending the money on the project, and that's kind of the bottom line. So your benefit cost ratio needs to be at least 1.0, which means you're saving $1 for spending $1. In general, studies have been done nationwide multiple times, and I believe the most recent study that FEMA has had a part in indicates that mitigation projects on the whole save $6 for every dollar expended. So the BCA is the tool you use to demonstrate project cost effectiveness. Next, please. So your sub-application must include the exported BCA file and all the backup documentation that you have assembled for the data that you input. So first of all, there's kind of two types of data, if you will. The first is what we'll call a FEMA standard value, and depending upon the project type or the hazard, there are standard values for a variety of the benefit cost analysis inputs. All right. So one of the most significant ones, and the earliest ones you will run into in putting together your benefit cost analysis, is project useful life. So there's a project useful life for every project type identified in the tool, in the BCA tool, in their help menu. There's a table which shows for, I don't know, at least a couple dozen different project types and categories. It has a identified useful life that you need no documentation for, or you can revise that with documentation. All right. So two things. If you don't include your exported BCA file, your project will not pass review. And if you don't include documentation for the figures you input, your project will not pass review. Okay. So your BCA needs to be accurate and sufficiently detailed. The National Technical Review will rerun your benefit cost analysis to confirm your findings. So what I will say is if you do not have documentation for a data entry point, then the review will turn that figure to 0. So I think you can imagine if you're doing math equations, which the benefit cost analysis is a very complicated equation, you turn too many of those inputs into zeros, you can see what's going to happen to your results. It'll go down pretty quickly. So the last thing to say about the data, make sure it's from credible technical sources. So there's lots of sources where you can get information and data for your analysis, and we'll cover a lot of those next week. Next, please. So this slide basically brings up to the point that not every project needs a benefit cost analysis performed in the Excel tool. For a number of project types, FEMA has identified pre-calculated benefits. So there's memos that are on the FEMA website on the benefit cost analysis webpage. So I would like you to go to those. There's pre-calculated benefits for a variety of project types. The ones that are most used here deal with acquisitions and elevations in the special flood hazard area. Certain wildfire project types have pre-calculated benefits, and there's a brand new one that just came out and effective September 30th, and that's for hospital generators. So I would encourage you to go to the FEMA website, download a copy of the memos, because the numbers were just updated. I don't have them off the top of my head, but I know they went up. The ones that were updated for elevations and acquisitions is multiple thousands of dollars. So check that out and see if your project can use a pre-calculated benefit. So basically what a pre-calculated benefit means is that if your project comes in under the pre-calculated benefit number, your project is automatically cost effective and you don't have to do any further benefit cost analysis. So those are great things to use if you can, even though it's limited to some specific project types. I know headquarters is continually looking at, how they can do this for more and more project types. Next, please. Okay, how can you document compliance with a variety of environmental or historic preservation requirements? And looking at the right-hand side of the slide, this is just a handful of the laws and executive orders that projects are reviewed under. So there's many more than that, but these are probably the key ones. So in terms of determining whether your project is compliant with many of these is to, gather documentation on your project, gather it earlier rather than later, and then depending upon the type of project you have, there may be different documentation requirements, and I believe the FEMA Go tool will help you out with that to an extent. So the more thorough the documentation that you have for EHP compliance, the faster it'll move through the environmental historic preservation review process. And that can happen when you have a detailed scope of work, you have specific property data for each property involved. One key data point that I will suggest that you always include in your property data is the year the structure was built, or the age of the structure, because the age of the structure is what's used to determine whether there may need to be additional historic preservation review involved. So If you just include those right up front, you won't have to be asked for them later. Again, as I mentioned earlier, photos, maps, sketches, designs, site plans, and so forth. And if you're able to identify the location of your project vis-a-vis habitat for endangered or threatened species, of cultural resources and that sort of thing, that always helps and will, again, speed up the compliance review that takes place. Next, please. Okay, we have a knowledge check, so I'll turn it over to Michelle. So our poll question here, what do we mean when we say a project is cost effective? So here's 4 choices, and you have about a minute and a half left to answer the question. Okay, you have about 30 seconds left. All right, there's our results here. So about half of you said the project's benefit cost ratio is 1.0 or greater, and that is the correct answer. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that. Next slide, please. All right, sending it over to Ravi to finish us out with some reminders and some resources and contacts you can make to help complete your project.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I do want to touch on some key reminders, starting with quality applications lead to successful applications, reviews, and projects. Also remember that project development is very involved. It takes time, dedication, and lots of documentation. Remember that a project sub-application should have a detailed scope of work, a schedule, a detailed cost estimate, feasibility and effectiveness documentation, cost effectiveness documentation related to the benefits cost analysis, and environmental and historic preservation documentation. Next slide, please. FEMA will evaluate submitted applications based on programmatic criteria and technical criteria and qualitative criteria. You can find information about all of these criteria in the NOFO, and you can also find information about programmatic criteria in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. You would also be evaluated on financial integrity criteria prior to award, and make sure that your application and supporting narratives explain the strengths of the proposed project and highlight any elements that are listed and the technical and qualitative criteria, if included. Next slide, please. Technical criteria would essentially be yes or no scoring on if the project is an infrastructure project, mitigates a risk to one or more lifelines, if it incorporates nature-based solutions, if there is mandatory building code adoption, if there's a BCEGS rating on 1 to 5 points, if there's an application from a previous advance assistance or project scoping award, if there's an increased non-federal cost share of 30% or more, or 12% for EDRC communities, and if there's a designation as EDRC or an economically disadvantaged rural community. Next slide, please. Qualitative criteria would include addressing risk reduction and resiliency effectiveness, addressing climate change and other future conditions, addressing implementation measures and the population impacted, and on if there are outreach activities and if partnerships are leveraged. Next slide, please. So looking at the life cycle of the BRIC application for this fiscal year, the Notice of Funding Opportunity was released in summer of this year, 2021. The application period opened on September 30th, and the submission deadline for applications is January 28th, 2022. Selections should be made in the summer of 2022, including pre-award selection notice, and the grants should be awarded December 2022 and after. This could take longer if there's lengthy environmental and historic preservation reviews required. The period of performance will start when the recipient accepts the award, and the period ends 36 months later. And then the closeout is due 90 days after the end of the period of performance. Next slide, please. So now we have some resources. Thank you. So this is the website for FEMA Go, where you manage the grants and subgrants. And if you need assistance registering, you can email femago@fema.dhs.gov or call 1-877-611-4700. Next slide, please. We have some links here to additional resources, including the Notice of Funding Opportunity and program support materials, resources for the BRIC and flood mitigation assistance webinars that came from FEMA headquarters. We have a link to the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance and a link to this webinar series that we're a part of. Next slide, please. And here are some resources for nature-based solutions, including resources we referred to earlier and the sources of much of the information we provided on that. Next slide, please. And here's the schedule for the webinar series. And you see highlighted there that the next webinar will be on the benefits cost analysis next Thursday, October 14th at 10 a.m. And Mark will be back to present that one. Next slide, please. So if you have any further questions related to hazard mitigation assistance and the BRIC program and pre-disaster mitigation, you can contact the non-disaster grants team. So this includes Rob McCullough on the far left, and Cynthia Palmer, our lead, Brendan Menegini, who's also helping to answer questions right now, Kayla Keelan, who's also helping to answer questions right now, and then this guy on the end on the right there, Ravi Dutta, he's okay. For any questions outside of mitigation, but still related to FEMA, you can contact the Region 10 Tribal Affairs team. So this includes Mr. Jay LaPlante, Ms. Aurora Lair, Ms. Erin Ward, and Ms. Ramona Van Cleve, and she specializes on Alaska, and their email addresses are provided there. So this concludes the presentation. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.